So our first topic for Earth and Life Science, I will be focusing on life sciences first. And then after ng topics for the life sciences, I will move forward to the topic of Earth sciences. And the reason for that is because I believe that, or I think it is better if we get to know more about ourselves first as a living organism or as humans. We need to have a better understanding of ourselves first before we can start caring for our environment. So the same idea na, syempre, kailangan mo munang tulungan ang sarili mo, mahalin ang sarili mo before you can help and before you can love other people. So the same then, let's try to understand us first before natin intindihin yung ibang bagay. So that's my rationale why I want to focus first on topics on life sciences, so living organisms first. And once we have established an understanding of living organisms, saka natin pupuntahan yung non-living organisms and our responsibility to the environment as stewards of the earth. Sa tingin ko, mas magagampanan natin ng maayos yung role natin na pangalagaan yung environment and other forms of creation once we have an understanding of our self at kung gaano ka-importante yung buhay. Okay? So again, for this semester, third quarter will focus on life sciences, and then for the fourth quarter, we will focus on earth sciences. Okay, so the first topic under life science is the idea or the question of where does new life come from? So a few millennia or centuries ago, ito yung isa sa pinaka matinding tanong ng mga philosophers and scientists. Saan nga ba nanggagaling ang buhay? And even now, we have understanding of this life, pero hindi pa siya yung complete or hindi pa siya 100% accurate. There are still some areas in science that there are still some areas in life that cannot be explained by science. And hopefully in the future, we will have more or a better understanding of life through the evidences gathered by science. Okay, so dito papasok yung idea natin of faith. So science and faith, hindi sila magkaaway. Actually, they are working together to help us understand life and the world that we live in. So yung mga weaknesses ng science, yung mga hindi pa niya kayang i-explain, those are explained by faith and religion. Okay, so they work hand in hand. So the first question of where does new life come from is focused on the idea of biogenesis versus abiogenesis. So the idea of biogenesis, coming from the word genesis, this is the creation. So biogenesis means life is created from living organisms, which is the opposite of the idea of abiogenesis, which focuses on the idea that life is created from non-living organisms. So you have to understand that a few centuries ago, our philosophers and our scientists, they don't have the technological advancements that we have right now. So very simple and very limited yung mga gadgets nila dati. So for example, before they don't have a microscope, pero ngayon we have microscopes that are able to focus or allow us to picture yung very, very small substances such as the electronic microscope. So, syempre, yung mga data or the information that they are gathering before, very limited din. Kasi limited din yung kanilang observations. Whereas ngayon, we have a lot of equipments, we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of gadgets that allow us to observe more. So definitely, mas marami yung kaya nating i-explore at this age. But during that time, hindi naman ganun yung situation nila. So, yung question nila is very the answer to their question is very limited to what they can observe in real life. And later on, I will explain bakit nga ba sa tingin nila life was created from non-living organisms. Bakit nga ba nagkaroon sila ng evidences or nagkaroon sila ng idea na life comes from non-living organism. So before we look further into that, before we study the topic deeper, so I am going to present this essential question, the essence of our discussion for today. And later on, we will answer this essential question. So our essential question is, what are the different experiments that disproved spontaneous generation? So spontaneous generation is based on abiogenesis. So coming from the word spontaneous, ibig sabihin, ang sabi nila, the idea of life, bigla-bigla na lang siyang sumulpot dyan. For no rhyme or reason, bigla na lang nagkaroon ng living organism dyan. So ang foundation ng spontaneous generation is yung abiogenesis. Okay, so this idea of abiogenesis and spontaneous generation is based actually on the observation of people before. So sabi nila, during rainy season, very common daw na merong mga natutumbang mga puno. So sometimes malakas yung hangin, natutumba yung mga puno, or sometimes there are lightning, tumatama siya sa puno, natutumba siya. And people observe na a few days after mamatay at tumumba ng puno, merong mga mushrooms na nabubuhay on this fallen tree, tulad ng nakikita ninyo on the picture. And then, when you open the fallen tree, yung log na yan, you will see a lot of critters, mga crawling insects that are thriving inside the dead tree. And at the same time, they also observe, for example, even now, pag nag-iwan kayo ng tinapay sa lamesa ninyo, you left it open, you left it exposed to the elements, to the weather and the elements. After a few hours or after a few days, magkakaroon na siya ng molds. Especially pag na-reach niya na yung kanyang expiration date or yung best before date. So nagkakaroon na ng molds dyan. So based on these observations and other things that they observe in their everyday life, they come up with the conclusion na the dead tree is a non-living organism. The bread is a non-living organism. And yet, it was able to create life. Life in the form of the molds na nabubuhay doon sa tinapay. Life in the form of the critters or the crawling insects na nabubuhay sa loob ng fallen tree. And life in the form of mushrooms that thrive on fallen logs of trees. So sabi nila, and based on this observation, they came up with the theory of spontaneous generation. So this spontaneous generation, it says that life arises from non-living organisms. So yung non-living organism, which is the dead tree, it created life in the form of critters and mushrooms. And the non-living organism in the form of bread led to the creation of living organism in the form of molds, which is hanggang ngayon na i-experience ninyo or na-observe ninyo. So there must be some form of truth in this theory. Pero some people, they cannot help but question the veracity or the truthfulness of this spontaneous generation. So sabi nila, is there another possible reason or another possible explanation on how life was created, or where is the origin of this called life? So there are certain classical experiments conducted by several scientists. Specifically, we have 4. What they tried to do is they really tried to verify or to check if spontaneous generation is true or not. Okay, so ito na yung papasok na yung ating mga classical experiments. So the first scientist that conducted an experiment to check on the veracity of spontaneous generation is an Italian scientist who we call as Francesco Ridai. Okay? So, kung hindi nyo patapos yung inyong mga modules, ayan, nandito na ang mga kasagutan. Okay, so Francesco Ridai is an Italian scientist. So, very simple yung kanyang experimental setup. The materials that he used is 2 glass jars, okay? One with a cover or a lid. The other one, walang cover or walang lid. And then inside this glass jar, he put a piece of meat. Okay, so kung makikita ninyo on the picture, merong piece of meat dyan sa loob ng glass jar. And then he let this experimental setup go on for a few days. And he observed. Okay? So very common, pag nagpunta kayo ng palengke or talipapa, very common talaga na kapag ka merong piece of meat, pag may karne, di ba? Pag nagpunta kayo sa wet market na nagbebenta ng fish, ng chicken, ng pork, ng beef, all of those seafood, very common na merong flies. Di ba? Very attracted sila dyan. Even nga yung food ninyo minsan sa table ninyo on the kitchen, di ba? Minsan nakaka-attract talaga sila ng mga langaw. So, Ridai observed na may mga langaw na dumapo doon sa piece of meat. Naturally, syempre, yung jar that was covered, hindi niya na-touch or hindi na-touch nitong flies, itong piece of meat. Nandun lang siya sa cover. Pero itong experimental setup na walang takip, syempre, the flies were able to swarm yung piece of meat sa loob. And after a few days, Ridai observed the formation of maggots. Maggots kasi ito yung mga white na worms. Na-observe nyo siya usually pag hindi ninyo natapon ng maayos yung mga basura. After a few days, meron ng maggots sa loob. Especially if you have wet food or leftover food doon sa inyong trash can. Magkakaroon ng formation of maggots dyan. So the formation of maggots was actually observed doon sa jar na walang takip. Pero yung jar na merong takip, walang maggots inside the meat. Okay? But there are actually maggots na nagkaroon doon sa mismong takip niya kasi hindi nakapasok yung flies doon sa meat. So in conclusion, Francesco Ridai said that spontaneous generation is not true. Sabi niya. Bakit? Kasi sabi niya, if spontaneous generation is true, dapat both jars will have maggots on the meat. So kahit itong may takip, sabi niya, kung talagang totoo that life comes from non-living things, so dapat itong piece of meat na to will be able to produce maggots. Bakit itong walang takip lang ang nakapag-produce ng maggots? So sabi niya, may mali doon sa idea of spontaneous generation. And based on his results, sabi niya, posible daw ba na yung maggots, which is the living organism, posible daw ba na yung maggots na yon ay hindi nanggaling doon sa meat, but instead actually came from the flies. So meron namang reason or evidence kung bakit naisip niyang yung flies ang nagpo-produce ng maggots. Number one, dito sa open jar, sabi niya, na-reach ng flies yung meat. Kaya nagkaroon ng maggots doon sa meat. Pero doon sa jar na may takip, naka-cover siya, yung maggots nag-form, but not on the meat. It was on the lid, nandoon sa takip. Kasi yun yung area na nadapuan ng flies. So sabi ni Francesco Ridai, a fly or yung mga langaw, they are living organisms. And I think that sa kanila nanggaling yung mga maggots na nag-form. So from that experiment, Francesco Ridai created this theory that life can only come from another living organism, not from non-living organisms. So may evidence siya na nag-gather to prove his theory. So in conclusion, Francesco Redi is actually pro-biogenesis. His conclusion focuses on the idea that life come from living organisms. Okay? Pero syempre, napakatagal na paniniwala na ng tao yung abiogenesis. For how many centuries, for how many millennia, they believe that life come from non-living organisms. And even if okay yung naging experiment ni Francesco Redi, it is not enough to change how people think. Diba? Isa yan sa mga bagay na mahirap. Paano mo babaguhin yung opinion at yung way of thinking ng mga tao. So it required more experiments. So now let's go to the second scientist who conducted an experiment and tried to verify kung saan nga ba nanggaling ang life or the origin of life. So the second person to actually do an experiment is John Needham. Okay, so Needham, he created a different experimental setup. Instead of glass jars, what Needham used are flasks. Okay, so ito yung glass na flask. And because it is a flask, kung napapansin niyo, maliit yung kanyang opening. So hindi kasya yung piece of meat. So instead of a piece of meat, what Needham did was, he used broth. So when we say broth, ito yung mga pinaglagaan ng karne. Okay? So yan yung kanyang ginamit. In some literatures, instead of broth, ang ginagamit nilang word is gravy. So yung gravy kasi is ganun din. Pinaglagaan ng mga buto-buto hanggang sa makuha niya yung lasa. And then usually, saka siya pinapalapot para maging sauce. Okay? So John Needham used flask and broth. So ang ginawa niya nung una, nilagay niya yung broth in a flask. And then pinainitan niya for a few minutes. Okay? So meron siyang heat na ginamit. Bakit siya nag-apply ng heat? So sabi niya kasi heat can kill microorganisms. It can kill bacteria. So yung broth na yon, sabi niya, kung meron mang bacteria na nabubuhay doon at hindi ko nakikita, dahil pinainitan ko siya, ang kanyang idea is, dapat mamatay yung bacteria sa loob ng broth. So dahil pinainitan niya, ibig sabihin, na-ensure niya na no living organisms is existing here in this broth. Tapos tinakpan niya. Tinakpan niya yung kanyang flask. Okay? So ibig sabihin, dahil tinakpan niya, wala nang microorganisms in the broth. At the same time, in-ensure niya na walang makakapasok na kahit anong organism doon sa loob ng broth na yon. And then he observed. After a few days, napansin niya na napanis yung broth. So, idea is, kaya napapanis ang pagkain, it's because of the presence of bacteria. So, ang isang pagkain, if you left it open at napuntahan siya ng bacteria at dumami yung bacteria na yon, after a few hours, masisira or mapapanis yung pagkain. Kasi marami na yung population ng bacteria. The same in your mouth. Bakit nga ba may panis na laway or bad breath kapag umaga? Kasi you have to understand that there are bacteria in the food that we eat and there are bacteria inside our mouth. Nababawasan sila when you brush your teeth. Pero when you sleep during the night, syempre hindi ka naman nagbabrush habang natutulog ka. So dumadami yung bacteria sa loob ng bunganga mo. So after a few hours, 6 hours ka natulog, 8 hours ka natulog. Yung iba dyan, 14 hours para matulog. Ang tagal ng panahon na binibigay ninyo for the bacteria to grow and multiply. So napakadami na ng population nila. So pag gising ninyo, automatic, may dragon breath na kayo, nakakamatay. Kasi ang dami na ng bacteria sa loob ng bunganga ninyo. The same in your underarms. Hindi mabaho ang pawis. Kaya nagkakaroon ng body odor, it's because of the bacteria. So, pag naligo kayo, fresh na fresh yung feeling ninyo, fresh na fresh yung amoy nyo. Kasi syempre, walang bacteria sa katawan nyo. Nung naglaro ka ng basketball, summer, mainit, after a few hours, pinawisan ka na. Favorite ng bacteria yan. Yung mainit na environment, tapos moist, mamasa-masa. Favorite nila yan. Napakabilis nilang dumami pagka ganyan yung environment. So, sa kilikili mo, dumami na sila. Sa paa mo, dumami na sila. So, nagkakaroon ng tinatawag nating body odor. So, ganun din when it comes to doon sa broth. Nung dumami yung bacteria doon sa broth, saka siya nasira or napanis. So, bakit siya napanis? Eh, di ba dapat walang bacteria sa loob ng broth? So, sabi ni Needham, nagkaroon ng bacteria doon sa broth kaya siya napanis. So, ibig sabihin, yung broth na yon, which is basically tubig, pinagpakuluan ng mga buto-buto, is a non-living organism at nakapag-produce siya ng bacteria, which is a living organism. So, sabi niya, oops, wait lang, mukhang totoo yung abiogenesis. Mukhang totoo yung idea of spontaneous generation kasi mula sa isang tubig nagkaroon ng bacteria. So, ang naging conclusion ni John Needham is totoo ang spontaneous generation. His results and his conclusion is in favor of abiogenesis. Okay? But in reality, ang nangyari kasi kay Needham dun sa kanyang experiment is that hindi enough yung heat na in-apply niya doon sa broth. Saglit lang niya pinakuluan or baka hindi pa kulong-kulo yung broth. So hindi pa napatay lahat ng bacteria doon. So somehow, nabawasan yung bacteria pero meron pa rin natirang kahit konti. So nung tinakpan niya yung flask, yung natirang bacteria na yon, yun yung nag-multiply at dumami, which is the reason why na-spoil or napanis yung broth doon sa loob ng flask. Okay? But with Needham, his conclusion is he is in favor of spontaneous generation. So, opposite na sila ng idea ni Riday. Si Riday, sabi niya, hindi totoo yan. Si Needham, ang sabi niya, totoo yung spontaneous generation. So, medyo stalemate sila. So, people are still undecided kasi may contradicting results from two experiments. At saka sabi ko nga sa inyo, for a very long time, that is their existing belief. So, hanggang ngayon, pinaninindigan nila yung idea of spontaneous generation. So, now let's go to a third scientist. His name is Lazarus Spallanzani. Okay? So, Spallanzani, gusto lang niyang ma-check kung sino ang totoo, si Riday or si Needham. So for the purpose of his experiment, he used the setup that was followed by, anong tawag dito, ni Needham. So he also used a flask, he also used broth, and he also applied heat. So sabi niya dito, ito yung broth, nilagay niya dun sa flask, tapos, pinainitan niya. Minake sure niya na kumulo talaga yung broth na yon. And then, he left it, pinalamig niya kahit papano. So, he left it to cool down. After niya pakuluin, pinalamig niya konti. And then, one flask, ito yung ginaya niya kay Riday. Yung isang flask, may takip. Ito yung sealed. Pero yung isang flask, it was actually left open. So, he observed this for a few days. He checked kung, anong tawag dito? Kung anong mangyayari. So, similar doon sa naging result ni Riday, yung flask na walang takip or that was actually left open, napanis siya. So, it was spoiled after a few days because of the growth of bacteria inside the broth. Okay? And then, similar doon sa naging result ni Riday, yung flask na may takip, hindi siya napanis. Okay? Okay pa yung broth after a few days, which indicates na walang nag-grow na bacteria doon sa flask na to. So to further verify his result, ang ginawa ni Spallanzani, yung flask na may takip at walang nag-grow na bacteria, after a few days, tinanggal niya yung takip. At na-observe niya na nung tinanggal niya yung takip, saka napanis yung broth, which indicated na nung tinanggal niya yung takip, saka nagkaroon ng growth of bacteria inside the broth. So based on these results, sabi ni Spallanzani, there must be something in the air. Hindi ko nakikita, pero maaaring merong living organism in the air na nung pumasok siya doon sa flask, yun yung naging dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon ng bacteria doon sa flask at napanis yung broth na nasa loob ng flask. So sabi niya, I think, based on my experiment, spontaneous generation is not true. So ang naging conclusion niya is very similar to Francesco Riday. He is in favor of the idea of biogenesis. So sabi niya, merong living organism in the air which produce the living organism doon sa broth. Okay? So unfortunately,